Thank you, John. John's introduction of Holly this morning would be apt for me because my role here, very interesting presentations, is both last and least. Because I am delivering the presentation on behalf of our Director of Languages, Miranda Huron. And so apologies for that. I was considered not providing it in the interest of time, but I do feel that there is an important national legislative context that I want to bring to here with respect to Indigenous languages in Canada. And so I will abbreviate where I can. So we recognize the overwhelming majority of threatened languages around the world are Indigenous languages, and in Canada that is just as true. Indigenous languages are the conduit for the transmission of philosophies, values, ceremonies, histories, among other things, including Indigenous ecological knowledge. Indigenous languages remain as living languages sourced from the lands transmitting Indigenous knowledge, traditions, and philosophies, and are enacted in ceremony and ritual. However, in Canada, in 1876, the Indian Act, combined with residential schools, the 60s scoop, child welfare issues, have had a negative impact on the stability of Indigenous languages, cultures, and identities, and this has resulted in a devastating loss of traditional knowledge. But studies show, and this was alluded to in some of the earlier presentations, that when countries give formal recognition to Indigenous languages, the likelihood of survival increases. So it's very important to take action to reclaim and revitalize Indigenous languages. Today, Bill C91, an act respecting Indigenous languages, is being considered to support and provide adequate and sustainable funding for Indigenous languages preservation in Canada. Culture and nature are inextricably linked. At a global and even regional scale, studies show the strong correlation. Indigenous knowledge reflects a relationship developed over millennia and has influenced Indigenous relationships and interactions with the land base based on adjustments to changes in the environment. Indigenous peoples have been using these knowledge systems to live in a sustainable way across many different environments. Traditional knowledge is reflected in language in many ways, including through place names and oral origin stories. And these stories can provide knowledge on local species and their medicinal uses, as well as migration patterns of animals and other features of place that were alluded to by Colin in the keynote that are intimately tied to specific environments. The maintenance of linguistic diversity is therefore closely related to an understanding of the natural environment and a way of life that is tied to oral teachings. These teachings are typically passed down to younger generations through oral traditions. Continuing the transfer and application of this knowledge is only made possible through ongoing intergenerational communication from elders to youth and in a respective Indigenous language. Let me try to skip through here a bit. In Canada, Indigenous peoples have been fighting for decades for legislation that recognizes and affirms language rights to support the revitalization and normalization of Indigenous languages. On December 6th of 2016, current Prime Minister Trudeau announced that the Government of Canada would jointly develop legislation for the revitalization and recovery of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis languages. On June the 14th of 2017, Canada, the Assembly of First Nations, along with the other two national Indigenous organizations, agreed to a statement of co-development principles to co-develop legislation. The co-development process included numerous engagement sessions with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, either led by Indigenous organizations or the Department of Canadian Heritage. The AFN led engagement sessions in 2017 with rights holders and others, including speakers and knowledge holders. And the AFN also participated in Canadian Heritage's intensive engagements in 2018 to ensure First Nations input was reflected in the legislation. Co-development principles based on these engagement sessions have informed the co-development of Bill C91. Bill C91 was introduced in the House of Commons on February 5th of this year. According to Nanos Research, a survey conducted in 2017, approximately 74% of Canadians were found to be supportive of the development of an Indigenous Languages Act. And this legislation is consistent with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, as well as the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, both of which are supported by First Nations and both of which Canada has pledged to honor and implement. Bill C91 is currently in third reading in the House of Commons, and the AFN and the Department of Canadian Heritage are continuing co-development work on an implementation strategy. However, Bill C91 must pass before the House of Commons rises next month in June, on June the 21st, and receive royal assent, as this is the last opportunity to do so before the upcoming federal election in October. So on that basis, in conclusion, we want to recognize that First Nations languages are national treasures, central to First Nations identity. There are also unique resources to better understanding our environment. And with that, I want to say thank you very much. I'm looking very much forward to going to Ganawagi. Thank you.